Thank you to everybody for coming along tonight to celebrate with us Diamond's inaugural lecture as Professor of Law in IELTS. I'm really genuinely delighted to introduce her to you, and particularly so as this is the first of these duties I've performed as Dean in SOAS, because I've only been in the role for a week or two. Diamond has had a glittering career. I thought making this introduction all around plays on your name, you know, multifaceted and crystal clear and all that kind of thing, but that was brilliant, you know, that would do. But before coming to IELTS, she held a professorship at SOAS, and before that a readership at UCL. She's published widely and impressively with books on the EU, on labour law and on regionality. And her 2005 OUP monograph, European Employment Strategy, Labour Market Regulation and New Governance, won the Peter Burke's Prize for Outstanding Legal Scholarship. Her catalogue of articles and chapters is equally formidable, as is her achievements in grants and awards, and she's held many distinguished positions, often internationally, and fellowships abroad, including Harvard and Columbia in the US, in Italy, Switzerland and Melbourne in Australia. There are many threads to her work. Labour as an economic, social and legal activity would be one. Engaging efforts to understand not only the processes and arrangements which structure our societies, but also the context over values which those embrace. Internationalism is another one. And it is perhaps that, or perhaps both of these things, that she's going to talk to us tonight. Though my deanship is recent, I worked a little with Diamond previously, and I warmly admire not only her range of interests, but also her energy, her clarity of insight, her readiness to work with others, and her savviness about the current situation in higher education and in societies at large. So, ladies and gentlemen, could you join me in welcoming Professor Diamond Ashiagbor, who will speak on telling stories about law and development.
So thank you very much to Jules and to Rick for their kind introductions, and thank you for coming to this lecture. So the purpose of an inaugural lecture is to showcase the scholarship of the person giving the lecture, but also to celebrate the institution in which it's been given. And so, as Jules mentioned, this institute is one of 9 specialist research institutes which comprise the School of Advanced Study. The others research on history, art history, philosophy, literature, modern languages. And I see this institute as having a distinctive role in providing a meeting place for legal scholars, organisations, practitioners from around the world, supporting and leading legal research and promoting new research agendas. And this complements the broader mission of the School of Advanced Study, which is to promote and facilitate research by national and international humanities scholars. So one of the things I want to do in this lecture is to locate this institute at the forefront of such interdisciplinary research in law, society and the humanities. So a couple of examples of that. Earlier this year, we hosted an annual lecture by Professor Lyndall McCarthy of the LSE Law Department entitled Ways of Seeing Law, What Can Art History Tell Lawyers About Their Discipline? Okay. So I hope this lecture continues that tradition of interdisciplinary research in law, society and the humanities. So just so what I mean by the title, Telling Stories About Law and Development, that's borrowed from a lecture series I co-organised when I was at SOAS with Antara Halder, who is in the Faculty of Law at Cambridge University. And what we wanted to do with that lecture series was to bring together filmmakers, writers and academics to tell stories about law, politics, gender, development in the global south, by which we meant developing countries, and the south in the north by which we meant the presence of people from developing or transition economies in industrialised ones. So in that lecture series, speakers turned their attention to international economic disorder, secularism and its critics, how not to write about Africa, and the intersection between politics, culture and colonialism's political logic. So turning to this evening's lecture, As Rick mentioned, the focus of my work is to explore what space there can be for labour law and social rights in projects of regional integration. So that summarises the entirety of my research, well, not quite. But I've examined that question in the context of the European Union, and now also increasingly in the context of the African Union. Academic disciplines such as labour law, or scholarship on development, or on trade, tend to unite around dominant narratives or stories. With labour law, we can say that it has coherence as a discipline because it's often a location for attempts to resolve questions of economic efficiency, redistribution, fairness, equality, justice, development. It tries to do a lot. But labour law scholarship does have a dominant story to tell, a dominant narrative, which has been shaped by its emergence in what we would call the hegemonic countries of the global north, emergence from industrialised countries, and which is shaped also by the particular economic history of the regulation of the primarily Fordist industrial productive relations, and also regulation which evolved alongside the protective capacities of industrialised states. By protective, I mean social protection, during the 20th century. So what I want to do in today's lecture is to examine how the normative project of labour law can be realised by thinking through different institutions which emerge from and are applicable also to the global south as well as the global north, and which don't presuppose formal labour relations or broad capacities of the state. So to do that, I'm going to explore three sets of stories. I am interested in three areas of contestation. First, how can we better conceptualise that relationship between economy, society and law? Second, of the many differences between the two regional integration projects of the EU and the African Union, I want to focus on stories about development and where the member states of those two regional blocs sit, located in the path towards economic development. And third, a related issue, is the extent to which and the terms on which these states are integrated into global trade. So the stories told within orthodox economics about how trade works and the role of law in this. So this first question, the relationship between the economy, society and law. What becomes clear is that insights which may have been pertinent to understanding the relationship between economy and market on the one hand, and state or region on the other, that develops in the context of countries of the EU, have less purchase in the context of the AU. And that leads me to turn to a more contextualised study of the economy and markets, or how we think of the relationship between markets and society. And in doing so, I draw upon the insights offered by an approach to bringing together these different disciplines, which is known as economic sociology of law. And that might be a bit unfamiliar to a lot of you in this room. So what that basically is the use of sociological approaches to investigate relations between law and the economy. So what I want you to think about, imagine a Venn diagram where you might think of economy, society or sociology and law, and you might think what I'm talking about is this tiny little bit in the middle of the three overlapping. That's exactly what I'm not talking about. So economic sociology of law as a way of thinking about our societies and our economies has been helpfully defined, I think, by sociologist Sabine Freirichs as an academic venture located in the middle of the social sciences. So she says economic sociology of law is not to be understood as an over-specialised approach which dissects, which is in the middle, legal, economic and social aspects and focuses only on the smallest possible subset. But instead, we should think about it as an integrative effort, reconnecting law, economy and society as spheres of reality and as fields of scholarly activity. So it's a Venn diagram where all three circles are actually overlapping entirely. So in attempting to understand the relationship between social rights and markets and the role for social rights in the operation of markets, I've gone back to, and also seek to go beyond, a concept known as embeddedness, developed by Carl Polanyi, some of you may be familiar with, economist. The main book of his I'm drawing on was published in 1944. Much conventional economic thinking on regulation, on law, is for the most part premised on an opposition between market and regulation, or between market and state and society. And this is true for the very orthodox neoclassical economic thinking, as it is for what economists refer to as new institutional thinking, which tends to take a little bit more account of institutions. And in particular, neoliberal ideology is founded on a belief in the legitimacy of markets. And to establish that legitimacy, neoliberals treat markets, usually without explicit acknowledgement, as existing outside society, outside history. The market is simply there. And if one accepts that the market emerged naturally, then state action is this added extra. It's an external, exogenous interference in the workings of the market. In contrast, scholarship within the field of economic sociology has done much to illuminate implications of thinking about law, which follow from a recognition that markets do not exist in a state of nature. And drawing on the work of Polanyi, the tradition of economic sociology challenges the idea that markets are a separate realm, arguing instead that they're embedded in social relations. So from a socio-legal perspective, rather than being natural phenomena, markets are understood to be constructed by society, constituted by law and social norms. So Polanyi's primary intuition is that economies are enmeshed or embedded within non-economic institutions. To function, markets need a network of socially agreed rules. Just to give you one very simple example, which we often don't think about, which is you can exchange goods directly. I exchange apples for olive oil, or you can exchange goods through a medium such as money. But for that to work, we have to operate within a socially constructed context where we both accept that fictitious commodity of money. Okay. So what's noteworthy about economic sociology, that approach, is this assertion of the importance of state action and social relations, not only in the terms of a regulatory response to markets, but constituting markets in the first place. So Polanyi meant by this the establishment, not only the establishment of rules to enforce contract and property rights. How can you have markets for buying and selling products if you don't have an agreed system as to who owns the product in the first place, and then when that ownership transfers? So not only in the establishment of rules to enforce contract and property rights, but further in the protection of society from market liberalism by anchoring markets within institutional regulation. And by that, to give you an example of what he meant by that, so he was drawing on examples of 19th century England. So examples of social protection which were essential in order to have a market were antitrust legislation, trade union legislation, legislation governing public health, factory conditions, workmen's compensation, municipal trading, public utilities. So hence Polanyi comes out with statements such as laissez-faire was planned, or even free trade and competition required intervention to be workable. So my contention is that taking that approach which economic sociologists have developed, and to think about it as a lawyer, and to think about it in the context that I've worked in for a long time, which is regions, my contention is that such ideas of embeddedness, markets are embedded in society, can occur at regional level, not just embedded in society within one nation. And so through a case study of the European Union, I show that what I and others have called this embedded liberal compromise of this regional integration project was predicated on the ability of these industrialised nations to embed the market within national institutions of social citizenship, principally, I argue, labour and social welfare law. But this national level social policy was ultimately shored up by social policy initiatives at EU level. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so just a quick tour of the EU integration project. Regional integration within the EU was premised on the existence, I argue, of background rules at national level to ameliorate the effects of economic liberalisation. So in 1951-1957, the draft of the original European Economic Community Treaties considered it essential to guarantee free movement of what they call the factors of production, goods, persons, services and capital, to attain perceived economic advantages of integration in general and the creation of the single market in particular. So those perceived advantages are efficiency in production made possible by increased specialisation, increased production levels due to better exploitation of economies of scale. You're not just producing for the Belgian market, you're producing for markets of 6 countries. Improved international bargaining position made possible by larger size, leading to better terms of trade. However, there is the creation of a market integration project, creation of a single market, there's pressure on national economies to deregulate to remain competitive, because national capacity to regulate markets is severely reduced by removal of barriers to trade. So if you are saying that something which is manufactured, say cotton which is manufactured in Manchester, is obviously could be sold in London without having to go through customs checks or import duty, what you're saying, if you're uniting 6 states and now 28 soon possibly to 27, if you're uniting those states, is that a product manufactured in Manchester should easily be equally sold in Paris, and actually a service delivered, a financial service delivered from Manchester should be accessible to somebody in Amsterdam without any barriers. And if you do that, it means that capital can move, investment can move, firms can move, people can move. People are less mobile than capital, or rather, states put restrictions in the way of mobility of people. So states may feel pressured to reduce protections such as fiscal rules, labour rules or other rules in order to keep or attract capital and foreign direct investment. But at the time in the 50s, the orthodoxy was there was no need to have uniform tax rates at EU level. There was no need to have uniform labour standards or wages at EU level to balance the liberalisation, the opening of the markets. The assumption was that the domestic welfare states would serve as social stabilisers. Yes, capital may move to a part of the EEC where labour is cheaper and therefore causing unemployment, but it will all work out in the end because that state will have mechanisms such as social transfers, welfare benefits, public infrastructure and labour law. Okay. So these background conditions, with regards to those background conditions, Andrew Lang refers to a shared commitment to the political ideology of embedded liberalism in the post-war era. So what he and others mean is that at the time institutions were emerging that were created by the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, institutions such that became eventually the WTO, the World Trade Organization, but certainly at the time International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, there was a shared commitment to this idea that in contrast to today's laissez-faire, perhaps neoliberal agenda, that the dominant philosophy forming the backdrop to post-war trade liberalisation and to regional integration such as the EU was a recognition that governments should intervene to protect their populations from economic instability and insecurity and to promote their own versions of the welfare state. So the institutional reconstruction of the post-war international economy accepted that trade liberalisation had to be embedded in society. With the EU, there was this initial hands-off approach that we don't need uniform tax labour standards, but that did evolve over the 60s, 70s and 80s to the creation of, to that view that you wouldn't need harmonised labour standards. That evolved so that there was a EU level, a supranational level social dimension to protect vulnerable regions, sectors and workers from the effects of trade between the 6, which became 9, 12 and so on, and also, importantly, because it's also a protectionist project, to protect vulnerable regions and workers from the effects of global trade. So you saw major redistributive policies within the EU, you still see them, adjustment assistance, financial instruments to address social imbalances, agricultural policy, structural funds. So there are a whole bunch of mechanisms which we might refer to as social regionalism. And just to give you a few examples, European Union scholars talk about European structural and investment funds. There are 5. They deal with, there's one governing maritime fisheries, there's one governing agriculture, there's one called the European Region Development Fund. Basically, all that means is billions of euro allocated to regions of the EU depending on GDP per capita. So regions with less than 75% average income are designated as less developed and receive half the spending. The less developed regions are concentrated, as you might guess, in Eastern Europe, particularly former communist countries that joined the EU since in 2004, but actually also the less developed regions exist in Greece, Portugal, south of Italy, Spain. The UK is unusual in being the only Northern European country to have any of these less developed regions. For example, West Wales, Welsh Valleys, Cornwall, the Scilly Isles. The UK also has 11 what are called transition regions, where the GDP per capita is between 75 and 90% of the EU average. Tees Valley, Durham, Cumbria, Lancashire, Merseyside, and so on. And it is curious that a lot of these regions also voted to leave the EU. I'll leave that there. So this embedded liberal compromise in the EU context, principally, I argue, involved embedding the European market in national social provision. And so it presupposed the existence and the capacity of national systems of labour law and social welfare law. What the EU did, it shored up living and working standards, not so much by direct transfers apart from these structural social funds, but by supporting individual states to do so. So you had minimum EU standards on environmental protection, consumer protection, labour protection, so that no one state can fall right down to the bottom and undercut the other. So essentially, social harmonisation that's emerged at EU level hasn't been intended as a replacement for the more substantial social provision assumed to exist at national level. The bulk of the burden of financing social transfers, ameliorating liberalisation, falls on the states. Now, there is a whole story to be told about how, in the EU context, a lot of that has been unravelling to a great extent, not just because, even before the current sovereign debt crisis. But I tell you that story about the EU because I want to make 3 points before moving on to talking more specifically about development and then talking about the global south. The first point here is the EU has illustrated how regional integration can complement efforts by states to protect society from market forces. It has shown the possibility, not inevitable, but the possibility of regionalism with a strong social dimension. Second, the industrialised economies of the global north, including those of Europe, undertook that opening of the economies of other states. They opened to regional markets and then to global markets in an era favourable towards embedded liberalism. It was permitted for states to intervene. And that applies to the evolution of protective capacities of individual states developing their welfare states in the 20th century, as well as the evolution of the protective capacities of the region. And one could say this in contrast to the current era of what one might call resurgent neoliberalism, or what Stephen Gill refers to as disciplinary neoliberalism. The third observation from talking about the economic story, and this is to be explored in the remainder of this lecture, is the ability of these industrialised states to embed the market through social transfers and welfare state regimes, and the subsequent embedding of the European internal market within national systems, was made possible in large part because of transfers from what I shall call the periphery to the core, from the global south to the global north, by means of uneven patterns of trade. So I want to turn the lens of economic sociology law and its integrative effort to reconnect law, economy and society to a study of developing states, in contrast to its more familiar focus on the industrialised states of the global north. And my question here relates to this development story and the terms on which African states are integrated into global trade. So with regards to the development story, what role is played by law in economic development? Is the adoption of formal legal institutions essential? Okay. So in telling stories about development, the theoretical conceptualizations of development, that is, what causes, what are the determinants of economic change, those conceptualizations are in an almost constant state of flux and contestation. So development is a way of understanding the world which is in a state of flux, and you have shifting dominance of competing approaches. One scholar, Bjorn Hettner, suggests development is one of the oldest and most powerful of all Western ideas. It's a very old story. And he highlights the hegemonic force of a narrative centered around ideas of growth, progress, onwards and upwards movement, premised on models which emerge from certain countries' experiences and prejudices. And this view is the root of what's known as the Modernization Theory, which is a story which adopts a kind of progress and modernity view, predicting the movement of countries from a state of underdevelopment by means of an imitative process, imitating what's gone on in other countries, less developed countries gradually assume the qualities of industrialised nations. And today, the development strategies of international development institutions such as the World Bank have coalesced around that story or versions of it, and around the rule of law as the key to transforming developing countries into market economies. Amanda Perry-Casares gives a very interesting account of the troubled evolution of law and development thinking. And she notes that one can identify the beginnings of a post-modernization approach. And what she says is this approach is characterized by a new attention to the limits of markets and an effort to redefine development as freedom, not just as GDP growth. An interest in a focus on poverty reduction. So this new approach to development doesn't offer a complete break from the earlier periods of orthodoxy. In particular, these new approaches still place the rule of law centre stage to understanding the development process. But what more critical scholars, such as Amanda Perry-Casares herself, more critical development scholars would say is they challenge assumptions behind the orthodox approach by theorists and practitioners such as the World Bank, especially the idea that you have to have particular legal forms, particular institutional frameworks which were adopted in the global north in order to have economic growth and development. So this discussion about the relationship between law, development and institutions is one which preoccupied Max Weber. And a version, possibly distorted version, of Weberian thinking central to mainstream the modernization approach to development thinking, law and development thinking. So Weber's observations on the central role of what he called rational legal systems in the emergence of modern capitalism and on economic development more generally have been co-opted by international financial institutions. According to Weber, one of the most important preconditions for the development of a market economy, he used the language of capitalistic enterprise, was the rationalisation and systematisation of law in general. You need to have predictability. You need to know that your agreements can be enforced. Okay. And so security gained from formal legal process. So in an interpretation which locates Weber in a way which sits in the middle of a US policy and thought on development, the sociologist Talcott Parsons outlined a modernization theory which posited things that you need to have in order to develop. There's a universal path towards economic development, and that features the emergence of differentiated social structure. You can't just have feudal org structures. This path features the centrality of free market entrepreneurs, and states that wish to succeed in economic development should do as much as possible to free constraints on entrepreneurs and investors. Now, in acknowledgement of a small group set up by my sister and her fellow sociology students known as the Talcott Parsons Appreciation Society, I would have to say that Parsons' interpretation of Weber is arguably misapplies Weber's typology in order to develop this universalistic account of economic growth, and that tends to place Weber in the service of a very specific, possibly American version of capitalism. But that orthodoxy has taken hold and has been very influential, feeding into what you probably know as the Washington Consensus, that view that all countries should adapt their institutions to a global template based on guarantees of private property, minimalist state, liberalisation of trade and capital flows. So that modernisation theory about how you develop, a Washington Consensus view, accords significant priority to private law rights. But what about regulatory law? What about the sort of law labour lawyers typically advocate? Neoliberal law development focuses primarily on the law of the market, and then regulation is presented as an unnecessary intrusion into that market. And relatively little concern is shown for law as a guarantor of political and civil rights or as a protector of the weak. So I want to continue this analysis of development by turning to the terms on which African states are integrated into global trade. And there are two facets of this critique of the modernisation theory which are linked. The first is a criticism of this free trade economistic underpinning of the theory, and the second is in relation to the colonial ideology inherent in the modernisation approach. So, post-war development discourse, I mentioned Talcott Parsons, emerged alongside the coming to the fore of a new international order. This is in the years leading up to a wave of independence of former colonised states. So that new international legal order ostensibly represented an anti-imperial project which facilitated decolonisation, but arguably didn't live up to this promise. So the extent to which this new international order was indeed a major pillar of development theory can be seen in the inaugural address of US President Harry S. Truman in 1949, and that address, one of the key points of it, redefined US national interests as being closely tied to the progress of other states. And it did so by identifying the phenomenon of underdevelopment. His basic argument was the US cannot progress if we're dragged down by the fact that there's underdeveloped states exist on the globe. So subsequent US policy focus and funding for research was directed to tackling economic development in underdeveloped countries, culminating in the launch of a decade of development by President Kennedy in 1960. So this economic analysis, this modernization theory, emphasizes formal institutions, and it's assumed that underdeveloped countries will follow a similar path to developed capitalist ones. It's a new school of thought, but it emphasizes industrialization as a route to development. In the long term, competitive markets free from state intervention. In the short term, it accepts the need for some government intervention. So you have views such as this linear characterization that traditional societies will move through stages of economic maturity to take off into sustained growth. That's Rostow's linear approach. So that the industrial past of Europe represents the future of developing nations. Another key contribution to this view of development economics was that by Arthur Lewis, who characterized developing countries by reference to the two-way split, the dualism of their economies, that developing countries are marked by the coexistence of traditional low productivity, rural, subsistence, agricultural sector, and a very tiny modern capitalist sector, and which was more technologically driven. Such divide will gradually disappear as agrarian surplus labour is absorbed into the capitalist sector through a process of industrialisation. So Lewis is very interesting. He's originally from St. Lucia, Afro-Caribbean Nobel Prize winner, and the first economic advisor to the newly independent government of Ghana in 1957. Unfortunately, though, even his theories didn't actually were not proven correct in reality, in that linear progression, that shift away from dualism, developing countries didn't actually industrialise in the way predicted by the orthodox economic approach. I want to say something about more heterodox, non-mainstream approaches, which contend that it's not the one path to be followed, and in fact uneven relationships between the global north and the global south have hindered the development of the south. Indeed, one hypothesis goes so far as to suggest that economic production and labour market structures of the developed centre and of the less developed periphery countries differ so greatly that free trade can actually be harmful to the latter. So one example is that there will inevitably be a long-term fall in prices of primary goods exported by developing economies, generally agricultural goods, natural resources, in relation to the prices of secondaries such as manufactured goods. So one argument is that industrialised countries which specialise, for example, in manufacturing or high-end manufacturing have an advantage because the supply of the output is relatively price elastic. So if, for example, demand decreases for cars, so does the quantity supplied. You don't necessarily flood the market, you can regulate production of manufactured goods. Whereas agricultural markets, which are predominant in developing countries, supply was relatively price inelastic. So if demand for your agricultural products decreases, the quantity supplied doesn't fall by so much. It's very difficult to shift your fields from growing what they were growing to producing manufactured products. And so, drawing in particular on the experience of Latin American countries and Latin American theorists, structuralist approaches to development point to a structure and asymmetry in the behaviour of export prices of primary and secondary products. So they say developing countries cannot just mimic what industrialised countries have done because the rules of the game are rigged. And so instead, they advocate what became known as development from within. This approach urged states in the periphery to industrialise by investing in infrastructure and development promotion to restructure domestic markets away from primary products, agricultural products, and away from exports. So it's called import substitution industrialisation. And this resists free trade, resists open markets, and it seeks to produce goods domestically and to stop importing manufactured goods, to shield one's infant industries, for example, through imposition of tariffs and other barriers. Okay. A related view, so that's a structuralist approach, related to that structuralist view, but a view which focuses more on the inequality of the relationship between the North and South. Dependency theory argues that the uneven terms of the trade does so more in the language of imperialism. So what this argues is that if some countries today are underdeveloped, it's arguably due to the operation of predatory capitalism in its colonial form and post-colonial form. So one argument is that the countries, so I'm quoting from Bernstein, the countries of the Third World were actively underdeveloped in the process of the emergence and consolidation of capitalism. The original centres of capitalism established their wealth and power through incorporating and exploiting other parts of the world. The primary accumulation of capital in the centre was fed through a drain of wealth from the satellite peripheral countries, typically involved in their colonisation, a surplus drain which continues to this day, even if the forms have changed, even if there's no longer direct colonial rule. So my argument is that historically, African countries have been deeply integrated into the global economy, but the terms of that integration have been highly unfavourable, to say the least. So it questions the view that the less developed countries can follow the same path of development as the highly industrialised ones. Catch-up by less developed countries is arguably impossible because of that unequal exchange. So these more heterodox approaches to development suggest that the effects of Western European capital entering regions such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia often manifests itself in terms of plunder or plunder veiled as trade. Seizing wealth from the places of their entry. So the argument here is that you had intercontinental resource flows which fed the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So this is going back before the era I'm focusing on, which is the post-war era, that these intercontinental resource flows fed the Industrial Revolution in Europe whilst leaving the donor countries systematically underdeveloped. So the argument here is that this drain on colonial or post-colonial countries is then exacerbated by the formation of the rules of the game of the global economic order once these states do acquire independence. Because the entrenched economic inequality of the South resulting from the colonial era remains unaddressed. So that unequal exchange is marked by a transfer of surplus value from the periphery to the core. So the argument here is to go back to what I was saying about individual EU countries, the EU as a region, embedding the market in the social and national level and regional level. The argument here is that embedded liberalism, which underpin the redistributive capacities of individual states of the North and the redistributive capacities of the EU integration project, were predicated on the transfer of value from the global South. So this pattern of exchange between the core and the periphery, the extraction of raw commodities from the South, the commodification of labour power of workers in the South, made possible the redistributive welfare states of the global North. So, the final part of this lecture, thinking about the global South. In what institutional structures then can the post-colonial state be embedded? If I've been talking about the need to shield society from the full force of the market, in what institutional structures can the post-colonial state be embedded? I use the example of the welfare state when talking about European countries. In my broader work, I explore two possible answers. That the post-colonial state can be embedded in, in the post-colonial context, markets can be embedded in the individual state or in the context of the region. And I just very briefly want to talk about the first in the context of the individual state and a little bit more about the second, the region, the African Union. So one example of societal self-protection, similar to welfare states in industrial north, is the evolution and then subsequent decline of what's known as the developmental state. So there isn't a single type of developmental state. The literature is very diverse on this, but a key example, a key story that's told by the developmental state is closely associated with East Asian countries, which enjoyed latecomer catch-up industrialization. So a key example of the developmental state scholars give is Japan, where the Ministry of Trade and Industry, even though you had very little state ownership of industry, the Ministry of Trade and Industry exercised quite rigid control over the private sector through bureaucratic government control. Similarly, examples are given of Taiwan and South Korea, which is held up as examples of governing the market, of substantial state intervention against the market. So these states developed not necessarily following that modernization approach, open markets, open borders, comparative cross-border trade. They developed following a different model. But what that paradigm, there's lots of contestation as to whether that East Asian model can apply to other contexts, in particular African states. But what I want to highlight just for now briefly is the ideal of the development state paradigm as a possible way in which one can embed markets, which is different from this kind of modernization approach. And what it does do is it challenges a more neoliberal view of development. But what I want to turn to more in the final few minutes is the possible way in which institutions can protect society from the market, and that's through regionalism. Developing states, individual developing states, lack institutional and economic capacity to moderate the harmful effects of market exposure. In particular, their economies are characterized by high levels of informalization in labor and other markets. It's highly problematic to expect individual states within, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, to be the main source of their own adjustment, their own social adjustment. So my question becomes, if not the state, what